Hi, I'm Alessandro. I'm a filmmaker and audiovisual content creator, and today we're going to learn together about basic lighting techniques to obtain a nice, balanced lighting in our videos. Movies are both literally and figuratively stories written in light. They're literally that because the medium through which images are captured on film or video is light. Without going too much into the deep, albeit fascinating waters of the physics of light, let's just say without light our eyes and cameras wouldn't see anything. As the great film director Alfred Hitchcock once said, there's no such thing as a face. It doesn't exist until the light hits it. It's just light and shade. We need light casting on a person, object, or landscape and then reflecting toward our eyes and cameras in order to see that person, object, landscape. But today I want us to focus on how lighting is used to tell a story. Consider these stills from different movies and really focus on the lights being used in these scenes. Think about what mood, what feelings and emotions the lights are trying to evoke, and what they're already letting you know about the surrounding environment and what's going on even without any more information. Notice the different kinds of lighting, the colors and light directions, and how light clearly isn't being used arbitrarily. It either looks to represent real life as accurately as possible, or it looks to express emotions that are otherwise impossible to express. Let's learn the basic types of lighting there are, how they can work separately, how we can experiment with them, and how we can bring them together to obtain a nice, neutral, quote-unquote, perfect character lighting, also known as the classic Hollywood lighting, or simply three-point lighting. We all use cameras in our phones and other devices. What takes just using a phone for fun and turns it into something professional is thinking about your intentions before you hit record. If we just put the camera wherever and pressed record, we'd probably get something like this. First thing you might realize is that the image is a bit dark, right? If we use the normal lighting that's enough for our eyes to see, it'll be too dark for the camera because our eyes are better made than cameras, so they're much better at seeing with little light. So right off the bat, we should know that in order to give the camera a good amount of light to quote-unquote correctly see, we need to use more light than what our eyes think is necessary. Take this scene for example. Notice how it's a very dark scene with very little light. Of course, in this particular case, it's exactly what we'd expect. It's natural for an outdoor scene in a little town in the middle of the night to be rather dark. But let's see how it was actually lit. A surprising amount of light for such a dark scene, right? What I want you to take away from this is that there's a difference between what looks good to your eyes and what looks good to the camera. When there's too little light to get a good image or exposure of a scene, we say the scene is underexposed. You might say, well, I never get very dark videos and I don't worry about lighting, so what's going on? That's probably because computers and phones are configured to digitally raise the brightness of an image when there's not enough light. But in doing so, it degrades the quality of the image as it introduces digital noise. And that's how we get this very noisy image, which we interpret to be of low quality. So we need to turn up the brightness of our lights before they go into the camera and not after. This doesn't mean we can't get good results without professional lights. Fortunately, we have the best light source there is, free, gratis, and for nothing. Sunlight. Indeed, the sun is normally available a good chunk of the day. It's free to use for everyone, it generally offers much more luminance than what we need, and it even is the best quality light possible. Because sunlight is so practical and is actually one of the easiest lights to work with, as it's basically already set up and waiting to be used, I'm going to recommend that you guys use it as much as you can. So let's start solving the darkness issue by putting up our first light, our main light, also called key light. Here we have our subject, which in this case will be you, and this is the camera on whichever device you have. Naturally, the first thing we'll think to do is place our light right in front of the subject. It's not the most artistic lighting, but generally speaking, if anything needs to be clear on screen, it's the subject's face. So a frontal light directed toward the face will certainly do it. However, here we run into our first obstacle. Just as there can be too little light, there can also be too much light. Or in technical terms, it'll look overexposed. Something that's overexposed is where there's so much light that there's no detail at all. Here, our subject is overexposed in terms of what a nice exposure looks like. It doesn't look terrible. We can still see the subject's face well lit. lit, and that's important. Now our subject is overexposed way beyond the possibility of fixing. It simply lost too much detail that we can't ever retrieve. So I would say this shot is, in most circumstances, unusable. The basic takeaway is, don't underexpose, but also don't overexpose. I know this sounds arbitrary, but there's no absolute formula here. It depends entirely on each particular scene and circumstance. Essentially, whatever looks good to you is what you want. Taking that into consideration, direct light, no matter where it's coming from, tends not to look too good because it creates bright areas and dark shadows, bringing out all the little imperfections, and it just looks quite harsh to the viewer. Of course, this may be what you want, but if it isn't, the way to fix it is to diffuse that light. To diffuse light basically means you take light that comes straight at you and you break it up, forcing it to spread before finally hitting you from different angles. We can basically make diffusers out of anything. White sheets or a light white curtain would work fine. The more irregular the surface, while still allowing light to pass through, the better, because that'll more effectively break up the light. If you don't have sheets or a curtain, even a surface that doesn't let light through, such as white walls or even white cardstock, will do, because when you bounce direct light off irregular surfaces, the light will break up and you'll obtain a nicer look. Notice the difference between soft and hard light. See how the lighting here is very direct and hard and creates hard shadows, so we call it hard light. And this one, because it breaks up and reaches the face in different angles, is more evenly spread across the face, the result being it looks softer and creates soft shadows, which is why we call it soft light. Which one do you think looks more pleasing? Generally speaking, soft light is preferable, though hard light can be used for certain stylistic effects, so you'll want to play around with hard and soft light to get the aesthetic you want. Another great source of diffuse light is an overcast sky, because the clouds are actually working as natural diffusers, breaking up direct light and bathing everything with a nice, even light. So basically what I want you to take away from all we've just talked about is that sunlight is a great main light source, and that what I recommend is you put your subject in front of a window to be able to use that sunlight that's coming in. You can control the brightness of the light by having your subject sit closer or farther from the window, and if the light is too harsh, you can diffuse it using either thin curtains or covering the window up with a sheet, or having the light bounce off some white surface before it hits you. Finally, as we've mentioned, on overcast days, clouds act as a natural diffuser, and the light you'll get from the window will probably already be quite diffused and you won't need to do anything else. Now let's tackle the fact that front light is boring. It tends to flatten the features, as it takes away light and shadow contrast on faces and makes them more 2D. All in all, it's not a natural looking light because more often than not, light actually arrives at an angle. Now, this is what it would look like if we got our main or key light and put it to our side. By the way, from now on, as you can see, we'll be using soft light because of all we've just discussed, unless I specifically mention it's hard light. You can already see that light coming directly from the side doesn't look that natural, even less natural than front light. And just like front light, it doesn't look too good either. It casts dark shadows on the side that's not lit, but this time we can actually see the unlit side, and for our purposes it doesn't look good. So side light is something we won't use too often. Let's go on to our next light, the backlight. Now, right away you'll see that this won't do for when you want to clearly show your subject's face. It's used when you want to hide someone's identity, because our most identifying feature is our face. Backlighting, when used on its own, serves to show that there's a person or something there without showing the audience who or what exactly it is. It's used to create mystery, and also it's often used to create suspense, which is why it's a preferred lighting for horror movies, for that scene when you're about to be scared by the character. In these cases, we tend to use hard light instead of soft because here we do need to create a sense of unnatural features and displeasure. So again, this might not be the best fit for our purposes, but it doesn't mean it's bad lighting. Our next light is closely related to the one we've just seen, in fact. You might have noticed that I used this light to aid with the eerie aesthetic of the horror scene, specifically during the lightning flashes. I'm talking about the classic ghost story around the campfire lighting. That is, when we get the light source under us, and generally we want it to be a hard light too, to get all the contrast of the light and shadow that somewhat deforms the features of our face. This light is very unusual. It doesn't often happen unless one purposefully looks for this aesthetic. Our final quote-unquote bad lighting technique is basically the opposite of the previous one, the top or vertical light. This is unfortunately one of the most usual ones in terms of light being used incorrectly or without much thought behind it. Be it because we're recording video outside under direct sunlight, or because we find ourselves in a dark room and look for the first ceiling light to stand stand under, this is a go-to light for most people. In most cases, it looks really bad. It's non-flattering hard light with dark shadows. Sometimes it makes you look tired. Sometimes, especially when you're outdoors and it's midday, it forces you to squint your eyes and wrinkle your face. In most cases, because it tends to be direct hard light, what you tend to also get is a completely overexposed forehead and nose. So unless your scene involves a UFO shining its beam down on your subject, the only way to make this kind of lighting work is through diffusion. Okay, so we've seen 5 lights up to now: front, side, back, bottom, and top. A happy medium between the front and side lights would be a good idea for a key light. Let's place our key light at a more or less 45-degree angle from our subject, like this, and make sure it's casting on our subject in a soft, even way, be it through some kind of diffuser, by bouncing the light, or because the light source itself is diffused. So now we have an interesting key light. We don't have flat 2D features. We have some shadow, we have enough variance so that the 3D quality of real life is represented without going too over the top and accentuating every nook and cranny of your subject's face. The key to getting a good main light is in fact displacing the light so that it A, clearly displays the subject's face, but B, doesn't cast directly on it from the direction of the camera, as that would flatten the features and subtract interest. So really, you can play with that. It doesn't have to be a light displaced horizontally, it could be displaced vertically. In other words, the happy medium could be found between the front light and the top light. If we add just 2 more lights to our setup, we can actually obtain really pro-looking results. So we have our key light at 45 degrees from our subject, and that looks interesting, but perhaps a bit darker on the shadowy side. If our shot is dramatic, maybe this moodier look would work, but generally speaking, we would like to bring up the light just a bit on the side of the face opposite from where the key light is coming. For this, we will use a fill light. It's called a fill light because it aims to fill up those shadows and give us back some detail. We could use another light source, one that's less luminant and also diffused, but a great way of achieving this without needing another light is actually by bouncing the light that's already coming from our key light. So what you do is add a white surface on the opposite side so that it catches the light from the key light. Now we're fulfilling 2 of our main things we wanted. A, we're making sure the face is clearly visible, and B, we're doing it in a way that's interesting and not flat. And again, this is where we could stop, but the 3-point Hollywood lighting has one more recommendation. In order to make the subject really pop out from the background, we can use our trusty friend, the backlight. Notice how when mixed with a nice lighting that clearly shows your subject's face, the backlight actually seems to draw a border on our character, defining it a bit better against the background. In fact, here we just have a generic black background, but when placed in front of an actual, real-life background, notice that this backlight is really quite effective at popping our subject out of the background. This is 3-point lighting, or the classic Hollywood lighting. A key light, a fill light, and a backlight. This lighting, just like all the others we've seen, isn't perfect for every circumstance, obviously, but it is a classic and it's very versatile. You can see it in action in these different circumstances: key light, fill light, backlight, 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 key light, fill light, backlight. Let me just tell you, if you can pull off the 3-point lighting, you're well on your way to obtaining very professional looking videos. So here's an example of a simple setup you might be able to do just using what you have around the house. Of course, you don't want to use whatever light there is, you want to control it. So make sure you choose your key light and set yourself where you need to be to make it interesting. Here we're using the window, so you place yourself at a distance where you don't get direct light on you, especially on your face, and also get a nice exposure, not too dark, but also not too bright. You want to fill up some of those shadows on the opposite side though, so you get something that can bounce off some more of that main light onto your face. This could even be a piece of white paper. Because we're trying to not get any direct sunlight on our face, there might be other parts of your body or the background that are actually getting lit up a bit better than your face right now. So we could do with raising the brightness of your face a bit more to make it clearer and separate it further from the background. We basically use another fill light. Again, any surface that bounces light will do. A white tablecloth is a perfect option, and notice the subtle yet important difference it makes. Now we're focusing on that face. As a backlight, we might be able to bring in a lamp you have at home. If you can get it right at the back and hidden from the camera, you can point it directly at your subject. But in our case, probably it will be best to bounce it off something, the ceiling for instance. This will also fill up other shadows with more light, and it may even create a nice slight focus on the background, which will give it a bit more interest. Now we have a pretty good setup and we're off to the races. In this case, we're trying our best to keep away from direct sunlight, but we will probably have to have some kind of direct light to our face if we want to get a good exposure. We can solve that by adding a diffuser to the main light. Some kind of white cloth or sheet will do the job. And notice the difference that makes. You lose a bit of light, but the kind of light you get is much more soft. Take special notice to the side of the face closest to the window. Now there's actually light from the window casting on it, albeit diffused. Now, what happens if for some reason you can't use a window as your main light? Maybe it's nighttime or a dark day, or you simply don't have a window with sunlight. Well, in that case, we'll do our best with the artificial lights we have inside. This might be a setup you could do with stuff you have around. Notice we're still using a surface to bounce our light off of, but in this case, it's not for the fill light, but rather the main or key light. We don't want to shine it directly on your face, as we know, so we bounce it and get a nice soft light. You'll probably need to get it real close to you though, in order to make the best out of the max light output of that particular bulb. Again, we use a lamp bounced off the ceiling, so it's diffused and it spreads all over to get a nice, even soft lift of any dark shadows that may occur. And finally, we're also using that tablecloth as a bottom fill to further lift up the brightness of the face and try and lessen any shadows that may occur from our light bounced off the ceiling. These are just a few examples of what you may choose to do with what you have around. Really, there are endless ways of setting up lights. When it comes to recording video, it's basically trial and error. You can follow the guidelines, but every circumstance will be different. The fact that you may not have all these resources at your disposal absolutely does not mean that you can't get a good or even great result. When things are easy, we don't need to be creative, and when we're not, it shows in the final results. So really, obstacles and setbacks help start our creativity flowing. You may come up with something completely different, and that's great. If there's one very important thing I want you to take away from this lesson, it's that in order to obtain a really good result, you need to experiment. I'm Alessandro, see you back here next time, and until then, have a great time experimenting.